Hey, what's up, you guys? I hope you're having a great week. Today we have Dr. Kirk MacGregor with us. We're going to talk about his book, A Historical and Theological Investigation to the Gospel and to John's Gospel. It's a very interesting book. I'm certainly excited about this. How are you doing today, Dr. MacGregor?
I'm doing very well. I'm just hoping that my voice holds out through this interview. I've taught 3 classes today, each one an hour and 20 minutes in length. So
Oh,
hopefully my
wow.
voice
Okay.
will keep going throughout this interview.
Well, awesome. That's actually one thing I had at the top of my list was on the top of my notes, I actually had a note to say, everything I've seen from you has been so clear and so comprehensive. It I was gonna say, it seems I can tell you're a professor, even not knowing that you teach at McPherson and so
Yep,
forth. But yeah, you just have this like clear and precise way. And sometimes I'm looking for the words. I'm like, okay, but I guess from your studies of history and philosophy and theology, like you've really spanned, as far as your academic career, a pretty broad range, right?
I have. And thank you very much for pointing that out. That's actually one thing that has always fascinated me and really guided my choice of graduate schools to attend. The schools that would give me the best chance of not just doing one particular thing, but doing a variety of things. So, having training in history of religion, which includes biblical studies, which we're talking about today, training in theology, training in philosophy of religion. The broad type of training is what I've always been interested in, and I end up teaching a wide variety of courses as a result. So, today I've had science and religion was my 8 a.m. and then religion and politics was my 9:30. And then I just came from LSAT preparation. So shift gears one
Wow.
more time to talk about the Gospel of John.
Well, that's awesome. Yeah, I really appreciate it. Honestly, I do. So I want to just read your little biography first. I won't maybe try to do this briefly, but Dr. McGregor got his PhD at the University of Iowa. He is an associate professor of philosophy and religion and department chair at McPherson College. He is an author of 6 books, including Contemporary Theology, An Introduction to Classical, Evangelical, Philosophical, and Global Perspectives, and and Luis de Molina, which is this book here. We've talked about
Mhm.
it before. If you're interested, check out that um, podcast. The Life and Theology of the Founder of Middle Knowledge. He also has written over 30 journal articles appearing in such forms as the Harvard Theological Review, the Journal of American Academy of Religion, Church History and Religious Cultures, Religious Studies and Theology, Philosophia Christi, which is this book here. He has an article, a great article I want to interview him on one day about the existence and irrelevance of gratuitous evil, I believe it is.
Mhm.
Great article. Um, and just a bunch of other good works that you guys would be interested in. The Westminster Theological Journal, Bibliotheca Sakkara, hopefully I'm pronouncing that correctly, International Journal for Philosophy of Religion, and the Hythrop Journal. Also, not mentioned, there's a lot of other stuff, including this book, Calvinism and Middle Knowledge. Very interesting that he's one of the authors of that book. Your contemporary theology course, I actually have that. I got it on Audible, and it's very interesting to learn about some of the. It seems like to me, after looking at that, um, a lot of that stuff I didn't get in some of my early church,
Mhm.
uh, like back, like whenever I'm looking, I was like researching early church or watching lectures and so forth. There's a lot of people in there that I didn't get, and I think it's because the church doesn't really regard them as people worthy of being taught about, especially some of the progressives, right? Boltman and some of these other guys
Yeah,
that are
I
really
think
have,
I think it
yeah.
depends completely on your perspective. So I did my master's degree at Biola University and I did my PhD at the University of Iowa. And it's interesting that at each school I took a contemporary theology class. And the persons who were stressed and the persons who were not stressed were exactly flipped in the two classes, as you might expect. So exactly the people that you would expect for evangelicals to think are extremely important over the last 200 years are the people that were stressed in my course at Biola, and none of those people were mentioned in my course at the University of Iowa. At the University of Iowa, all of the what might be called liberal or progressive or mainline thinkers were stressed, and the people that were presented at Biola University were simply not there. And so I thought that there was a need to acquaint both communities with the contributions from the other side, and that my view tries to give a balanced way of doing that.
Very interesting. Yeah, and I appreciated that as well because like I don't want to have gaps in my understanding of these things, right? I want to be able to look at these things that way. If I'm ever having a conversation and they say like,
Mm-hmm.
"Look, how do you not know about this?" I don't want to
Yeah,
look like,
it all comes up. That's why that was my guiding principle in putting together the book. What things are out there? If you were to say go to different churches in, say, your own town from different denominations, what types of ideas are you going to find there on a given Sunday morning? And in one sermon, you might find something that's like, oh, yeah, that comes from Tillich, or oh, yeah, that comes from Barth, or oh, yeah, that comes from um, Spurgeon, or oh, yeah, that comes from Moody. So being able to know that these things just don't pop into people's minds. Very rarely do people come up with completely original things in sermons, but normally they have a long intellectual history, and understanding that intellectual history is vital in assessing different views.
That's awesome. Yeah, really appreciate that again. And the thing is that like so Tillich and Barth and these other guys really interesting to really dig deep into like some of this that I wasn't as familiar with. And then we hear people like Robert Price and a lot of mythicists and other non-Christians bringing up these people and say, "Hey, look, I love this guy. Listen, look at what he
Yeah.
said here." And you're like, then you go to look and you're like, "Wow, I never read this stuff before." But so I really appreciate that about uh, that course. And so let's start with the book of John, the Gospel of John here. In chapter, really, we're only going to be able to get through part of chapter 1 today, really,
Okay.
because yeah, we're not going to range the whole thing. There are a couple things I want to touch on from later chapters, but only one or two little things. So basically, in chapter 1, you want to challenge the majority view of the anonymous scholarship or authorship, I'm sorry, and the sizable minority about the authorship by the Apostle John. So I thought that was very interesting when I first started reading, and I'm looking at the preface, and it's like, well, in chapter 1, I'm going to challenge the majority anonymous scholar authorship, and I'm going to challenge also the traditional church view of the Apostle John as the author, and you actually argue for um, the elder John or John the
Mm-hmm.
Elder,
Yes.
which we will be mostly touching on today. Just before we jump into the chapter 1 and like kind of some of the ideas there, I wanted to just say real quick for the audience what the other chapters. I got a couple little highlighted lines just to tell them what the other chapters about, because I think those are really going to make people go, wait, this is really good, but I need all that stuff. So chapter 2, and feel free to correct me if I'm misunderstanding anything. The literary, you begin with the approximately 50% of scholars who posit the literary and epistemic independence of John's gospel from the synoptics and the sign source underlying the four gospels. And you suggest that the sign source was composed by the elder John himself 2 decades before incorporating it into the gospel. Chapter 3 presents Jesus in an ontological equal but functionally subordinate to the Father based on an innovative exegesis of John 17. Chapter 4 presents Kirk's original view um, on the Gospel of John that the meaning of the phrase, it's in Greek here, but I think I remember it's like "eis tetheon" or something like. Can you remind me?
Pistuo ice. Yeah.
Sorry,
Pistuo ice, and then normally
and the accusative.
auton or pistuo ice, iesun. Yeah.
Right, with the
believing
accusation.
in him or believing into him. Right.
That is one of the things that I wanted to touch on today because I think it's
Hmm.
going to be really relevant. And so you're going to argue that that denotes a personal commitment to Jesus, analogous to marriage, and that'll
Hmm.
be important. Chapter 5, he's going to believing in he argues that uh, believing in Jesus, the name, an inferior and salvifically constitutes an inferior and salvifically impotent assent to Jesus' messiahship purely on the basis of his miracles. Rather, you postulate that um, the terms that are used are equivalent to sorry, it's another term in Greek that I'm blanking on right now, but it basically it denotes allegiance to Jesus. So this is going to be the chapter which is going to say, look, it's what's commonly taken as the miracles are what convince someone like um, you know you're going to challenge that and say, look, it's not about the miracles. It's that they should believe otherwise. And you talk about Thomas and so forth.
Well, that's not really the point of that chapter.
Okay, sorry.
So I do not agree with the hypothesis, which is widespread, that when the author of the Gospel of John talks about um, believing in or into his name, and that comes twice in the Gospel of John, once in the second chapter and once in the eighth. Most commentators think that refers to a second rate type of thing where you're believing based on Jesus' miracles, and that just believing on the basis of Jesus' miracles doesn't save. And I say, no, 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 you've got this completely wrong. Believing in his name, believing in the name of him, quite literally, in view of its Jewish referent, the name they're referring to Yahweh, it's not only talking about personal allegiance to Jesus, believing in him, but personal allegiance to Jesus as the embodiment of Yahweh. And so I say, no, that kind of faith is completely salvific. And then I go on to say that the proposed counterexample to that you have crowds in John chapter 2 who see the signs, the semia that Jesus is doing in Jerusalem, specifically his symbolic destruction of the temple, that they believe in or into his name, pistuo eis to anoma autu, and that they have saving faith in Jesus. But the reason why the text goes on to say that Jesus refused to entrust himself to him, which is a different construction, it's pistuo plus the dative case, is that pistuo plus the dative case refers to entrusting to or believing in someone as a political figure, believing in someone as political Messiah. In other words, Jesus is not saying these people lack saving faith. Jesus is saying these people misunderstand my messiahship. They think I'm going to lead a violent overthrow of Rome, and I'm not going to entrust myself to them, because if I did, I know exactly what the consequence is going to be. They're going to try to make me king by force in Jerusalem. They're going to form an army. They're going to march on the Antonia fortress and storm Herod's palace. They're going to perform exactly the type of violent messianic overthrow that for 3 years that Jesus has been telling people not to do, and that the way of violence is not God's way. And so that's the reason why Jesus does not give himself over to the crowds. It's not that he's saying they don't have salvation. They do. It's that they misunderstand his messianic significance. They're going to take it politically, and he knows if they do that, then they'll get themselves all killed by the Romans, and plus
Sure.
they'll be out of God's will.
Yeah, so that was actually the second thing on my little list of things to touch from other chapters is one is revolutionary faith and then the wedding at Cana. So how those kind of relate. So yeah, I see the distinction you made there, and that makes more sense. Because I I was using it in a similar sense that Thomas, because you kind of apply this to Thomas, right? You're like, well, Thomas he's already seen all this stuff, right? In a not in this chapter, but you talk
Right,
about
right.
how he's
Yeah,
already seen all this stuff.
yeah, in the very last chapter of the book, what I argue is that Thomas is not, contrary to popular readings, this sincere doubter who he's almost convinced, but all he needs to do is to feel and to touch. And the popular reading basically understands Jesus saying, Thomas, you believe because you have seen. Blessed are those who believe without even seeing. They take that as Jesus commending blind faith. And that's not the point. What Jesus is saying is, Thomas, you've already had enough evidence to convince you that I'm resurrected from the dead. You've walked with your fellow apostles for the past 3 years. You know these people inside and out. They've reported to you that they have seen me alive from the dead. That's more than sufficient evidence to believe in the resurrection. And yet, despite that, you insincerely, because you're absolutely determined not to have anything more to do with me, you insincerely list various criteria that you think can never be met, that they're absurd. Like, unless I stick my hands into the side, unless I feel the nail marks, which, of course, when Jesus appears to Thomas and gives him a kind of put up or shut up retort, he's like, all right, go ahead and do it. Make my day. Thomas, of course, never does, because he wasn't sincere to begin with. He rather says, my Lord and my God. And Jesus says, Thomas, you've demanded to actually see, but rather what you should have done is to believe on the basis of the eyewitness testimony that you did have. And then the reader of the Gospel of John is in exactly the same position as Thomas, that I haven't seen a resurrection appearance of Jesus, but I'm confronted with this eyewitness gospel, which describes someone who has seen the resurrected Jesus. Will I do what Thomas should have done and believe on the basis of the evidence?
Yeah, that's great. So I really appreciate that. What we're going to do though is, because we're going to be short on time, is I'm just going to have to leave the chapter breakdowns there. The front of the preface of the book has like all of them broken down, so you
Mm-hmm.
can check that out yourself. The one that's really interesting is chapter 6, where you apply the doctrine of middle knowledge to the Johannine or
Mm-hmm.
Johannine paradox, that simultaneously God the Father chooses only some persons to be saved. Each person is able to freely choose between the saved, and you reconcile those claims, suggesting that God wants everyone to be saved. God middle knows that there's no world where free creatures can create, where he can create where free creatures would all freely be saved in different worlds. So free creatures can create other different groups of persons who would freely save and freely condemn and freely condemned. God's choice of which world would create simply is His predestination of every individual in that world whom God middle knew would freely receive the salvation. So that's something that I know you probably want to like make some distinctions there and say like, but let's get started on the Gospel of John. That way we I don't hold
All
you too
right.
long. All right, so let's try to get our John straight today, right? Because when we open the Gospel of John, within the first chapter, we have the authors attributed as John. We have John the Baptist. There's another John that's the father of someone. And being that our Gospel John is written by John already, we have a few Johns to already delineate from. Now the average person can easily come up within a few more Johns, right? Like John the Elder, may be familiar from church history. One might think of John the son of Zebedee, John the Revelator, right? You hear John the Apostle, and it's like, who are these guys? Are they the same? Are they related? And amongst the literature, we have First, Second, Third John, John's Gospel, and then traditionally Revelation. And so there's multiple Johns, and they're mentioned, multiple Johns mentioned by the early church and so forth. So let's talk about John. You argue that John the Elder is not the
Yes.
same as John the Apostle.
Yes.
And a lot of people will push back on that, right? They're going to want to say that there's, well, no, I've seen Papias's work, I've seen Irenaeus, I've seen, and they try to grasp it, kind of grasp at straws a little bit. But um, before we get too deep into that, let's start with um, You talk about the gospel. The fourth gospel begins and ends with an ancient literary device, which um, Bauckham has he termed the inclusio of eyewitness testimony.
Yes.
The device constitutes a form of citation where the author indicated an eyewitness source of a narrative by listing that person as the first non-public figure and the last non-public figure in the narrative. Do you want to kind of tell us
Mhm.
a little bit about that?
Yeah. So, an ancient form of citation is the inclusio of eyewitness testimony. So, in a world where you didn't have footnotes and you didn't have endnotes or bibliography, a way to indicate that you got some chunk of information from an eyewitness is to list that eyewitness as the first non public figure in the narrative. So, public figures would be people like Jesus or John the Baptist or Herod or the Pharisees. But you list that person as your first non public figure in the narrative. And then you craft the narrative to also list that same person as your last non public figure in the narrative. And the way the encounter between Jesus, Peter, and the beloved disciple are portrayed in John chapter 21, it's very important that the beloved disciple is the last non public character mentioned. And so when you have one of two disciples back in John chapter 1 who were originally disciples of John the Baptist, but heard John the Baptist say, "Behold the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world," and we're told that the second of those people is Andrew, Simon Peter's brother. First of them remains anonymous. And then we're told at the very end that this same person, the disciple whom Jesus loved, is none other than the author himself. Then we deduce that the material in between comes from that eyewitness source. And that's the way an ancient reader would have understood things as well.
Yeah, right. So you say that, in the book that there's these phrases that are used like this one of the two disciples, like
Yeah.
one of the two, and then you say like it's used multiple times throughout this
Yeah.
gospel.
One of the two disciples, the other disciple, the disciple whom Jesus loved. Yes, all of
Yeah,
those are different monikers referring back to this character who is only at the end identified as the book's author.
right. And then the other disciple, right? That's another like
Yes,
moniker that you
yes,
get as well, the other disciple. And it's almost like he's using it in a like an elusive kind of way, right?
yes,
It's like he's naming all these other people by name, right? And he keeps saying like one of the other two and like the other disciple.
yes.
So that's interesting because I guess I'd never thought about it the way that you've put it in the book because I was thinking maybe he just, had a limited amount of room. So, but yeah, it makes a lot of sense. So the last public figure named is the beloved disciple, right? Who is finally identified as the author of the gospel. Um,
Yes.
okay, so obviously you're going to probably get some pushback. So Peter turned and saw the disciple whom Jesus loved following them. He was the one who had reclined next to Jesus at the Last Supper, and he said, "Lord, who is it that is going to betray you?" When Peter saw him, he said, "Lord, what about?" Sorry. When Peter saw him, he said to Jesus, "Lord, what about him?" Jesus said to him, "If it is my will that he remains till I come, what is it? What is that to you? Follow me." So the rumor spread amongst the community that the disciple would not die. So
Mhm.
John did live a long life, right? And there's this rumor that he wasn't going to die until I think the parousia, right? But it was a rumor, and so this is kind of identifying John as the person who was leaning, or the beloved disciple as the person who was um, the one of the other character there, right?
Right, right. That when you say it's known or it's traditional that John lived a long life, it's important that we keep straight that in first century and in second century sources, that includes Irenaeus, that if you just read those narratives without hindsight of 3rd century, 4th century, 5th century, and so on writers, you would get the impression that the John who lived a long life was not John the Apostle, but was rather this John the Elder, or the Elder John, who was an elder of the church at Ephesus, lived in Jerusalem, had a house in Jerusalem, was actually a priest in the Jerusalem temple. We know from the 2nd century Christian writer Polycrates that he wore the petalon, or the high priestly garb and breastplate, or the priestly garb and breastplate, as he was serving in the temple. And that in the narrative itself of the gospel, we find that this other disciple, or disciple whom Jesus loved, has insider knowledge as to the conversations of the Sanhedrin, conversations that would be going on in the temple, in which someone like a temple priest would know. So the author is aware that there's this plot. The Sanhedrin have had this secret meeting after Jesus revivifies Lazarus and says, what are we going to do with him? If we let him keep going on like this, everyone will believe in him, and the Romans will come and take away both our temple and our nation. And Caiaphas says, you don't know anything at all. It's better for you that this man die for the people rather than that the whole nation perish. Also, we're told that even after all of the apostles forsook Jesus and fled, Peter tries to lag behind, but from the synoptic gospels, it says all of the apostles forsook Jesus and fled. But yet you've got this one who goes with Jesus in the company once Jesus is arrested, and is known to the high priest servant. And the high priest servant automatically gives whoever the author is clearance into the high priest's palace. And that would make perfectly good sense if the author is a temple priest, therefore would know the high priest, would have been a guest in the palace, would have been someone who easily cleared security at the palace. And it is that author who then goes out and brings Peter in. Otherwise,
Right.
I guess Peter might have wished that he hadn't brought him in, because then he wouldn't have had the opportunity to deny Jesus 3 times.
Correct.
But in any event,
Yes.
he
Yeah.
brings
So
him in. Yeah.
that's where we get you arguing that that the John the Elder, or or let's say the writer of the Gospels, is
Yes.
actually the a priest that knows the high priest personally, right? That's why
Yes.
he had
Yes.
access to the courtyard, and Peter had to be brought in.
Yeah.
The disciple that knew that was on the inn had to let Peter into the
Mm-hmm.
courtyard. Now that's you're kind of taking a little bit from some other scholars, or not taking. You're building on top of other scholars that came before you,
Yes.
like Bauckham and others, right?
Yes.
Hengel. So whenever we talk about this specific aspect of John, the whole courtyard thing, we have John, or we have the writer saying that, first of all, we know that because of who John the Apostle was, right? Where we're like, okay, well, could this be John the Apostle? Well, it's likely, given that this person lives in Jerusalem, that John the Apostle, who has a fishing trade elsewhere in Galilee, right, that he
Right.
doesn't live here in Jerusalem.
Right.
And also, you argue, and I'm just trying to put these things together, because really what the whole argument is, right, is that this is an important person.
Yes.
Okay, he owns a house in Jerusalem. He clears security at the
Yes.
where the high
And
priest
he
would be.
offers a distinct perspective. He offers a Jerusalem perspective on Jesus, which is why we have all of Jesus' visits to Jerusalem festivals in a 3-year period. We would not know from the synoptics that Jesus' ministry lasted for 3 years, or more precisely 3.5 years, were it not for the Gospel of John recording all of these things. Now, if the Gospel of John were written by John, the son of Zebedee, John the Apostle, we would expect it to read pretty much like the synoptic gospels do, because The synoptic gospels, Mark, you can show by using inclusio of eyewitness testimony that Mark embodies the eyewitness testimony of Peter. So we would expect that John's story, John the Apostle's story, would be roughly similar to his, and that it would have a decidedly Galilean focus because Jesus spent most of his time ministering in Galilee. But in the Gospel of John, when you see this heavy focus on Jerusalem and ignorance of much of what goes on in Galilee, and also the fact that this beloved disciple sits exactly where, given Jewish dining practices, you would expect for the owner of the house to sit if they were throwing a party for someone else, and this beloved disciple leans across Jesus' breast and asks, who is it that's going to betray you? It makes perfect sense to say that, yes, this is someone who owned the house in Jerusalem where the Last Supper was eaten. And also someone with that kind of stability makes perfectly good sense as to why Jesus from the cross would entrust his mother with care of this person.
Correct. Yeah, that's one of the things that I found was interesting as well, is you argue, you're like, well, look, you argue, like, you give the breakdown of the furniture and everything, right? The type of
Yes,
table and all, and you're like, we know the type of furniture, where these people will be sitting, and basically that if the author, if he, or if the beloved disciple, right, if he were he's sitting in the place of the person who owns the house, if he's not the principal person at
correct.
hosting the party, right?
Yeah, if
And
he were the
so,
principal person hosting the party, he would be seated where Jesus was. But we know from extensive study of Jewish dining practices that when someone who owned a house threw a party and they were not the guest of honor, someone else was the host, then that person would sit immediately to that person's right. And that's exactly where we know that the beloved disciple was sitting.
right.
So anyone reading that, I submit, would have said in the 100s, or even prior to that, the late first century, that we're dealing here with the owner of the house. And that certainly was the conclusion that Papias came up with. I mean, Papias explicitly distinguishes John the Apostle from the elder John, who, along with Aristeas, were two eyewitnesses who were long-lived, who were still alive during the 80s, even after the apostles had passed away. So Papias is a key source of information because he's writing his work, The Exposition of the Logia of the Lord, in the year 110. And he specifically says, look, you've got the apostles of Jesus, and they passed away. And at the time that Papias is describing, which is the 80s, he says, at this time, there's still John the disciple, the one who leaned back on Jesus' breast, and Aristeas, both of whom were eyewitnesses of Jesus, who were still visiting the churches, bearing witness. And it's that John the Elder, or Elder John, who is identified by Papias as the author of the fourth gospel. And likewise, Polycrates does this. And unless you read into Irenaeus the idea that when he says disciple, he means apostle, something that a second century author would not have done. A disciple is simply someone who follows Jesus. An apostle is one of the 12, and doesn't call this the apostle John, calls this the disciple John. And I think, as I explained in the first chapter, that there really is no way, given the sum total of evidence from Irenaeus, that Irenaeus views this person as the Apostle John. He sees that as a different person. It's only in the 3rd century and afterwards that enough historical distance has elapsed for the Elder John and the Apostle John to become conflated.
Right. Yeah. I noticed you mentioned that. So, like with the thing about Papias, right? He explains that to his unnamed, I guess, person, dictatee or whatever, that during an earlier period of his life that he collected oral traditions, right, about
Yes.
and that he says that he makes this list, right, mentioning separately the elder John from. So the list says, I inquired about the words of the elders. That's the
Hmm.
first group. According to the what is according to the elders, Andrew or Peter said, or Philip or Thomas or James or John or Matthew or any of the other of the Lord's disciples. So there's the disciples, and whatever Ariston and the elder John, the Lord's disciples, were saying.
Yes.
So it seems like he's making this distinction there, and this is one way you can
He's
separate.
making this distinction, and he references the apostles that you first quoted as that this is what they said, past tense. In other words, implying that they're not saying it anymore. They've said it. They're off the scene. But you've got the elder John and Aristeus who were saying, they're still saying it now at the time that this passage refers to, namely the 80s.
That's why he mentions the living and surviving voice, right? I
Yes,
guess
yes.
so, because with the Aristion and John the Elder, the Lord's disciples were saying,
Mm-hmm.
"For I did not think that information from books would profit me as much as information from a living and surviving source." So I know people are going to push back. I've already, heard from some people who want to say that Papias explicitly says that John, or they think that he says that John and the apostle and John the Elder are the same. I think you're right about that. I mean, it seems obvious, but you mentioned that the Quatrodeciman letter, right, from Polycrates,
Yeah, Polycrates.
or yeah, Polycrates. Sorry, it's hard to. So I get Polycarp and
Yes,
Polycrates,
my students
right?
do the same thing. Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So he says, indeed, in Asia, great luminaries have fallen asleep, such as shall rise again on the day of the Lord's appearing, when he comes in his glory from heavens to seek out all of his saints, to which John also, who leaned back on the Lord's breast, who was priest wearing the sacerdotal plate, both witness and teacher, has fallen asleep at Ephesus. So here we get John that's mentioned leaning back on the Lord's breast, right, at the Last Supper. Also, that he had fallen asleep at Ephesus, but that he was a priest wearing the sacerdotal.
Yes.
That's what you mentioned earlier.
Right.
Now, the issue is that scholars will try and say that, look, this can't be the case, right? Because only the high priest wore the sacred, like this certain, I
Or the
forget
sacerdotal plate.
the plate,
That,
right?
that's
But
that's the argument.
right, but you point out that there's actually evidence to support that that's not the case. In,
Right.
I believe it was the second, is it second temple period or second century? The
Well,
infancy gospel of James, I
yeah,
think.
the infancy gospel of James was composed around 150 CE.
Siege.
And there, it's clear that you're dealing with an ordinary temple priest who is wearing the petalon. So it's not just reserved for the high priest. Somehow I can't hear.
Oh, sorry, I thought I took myself off mute. Now,
Oh,
yeah, it's great because it actually shows that the common priest would use it as well.
mm-hmm.
Um, that it's not just the high, because the high priest isn't, that's like a job that's kind of below him, right, to do the common work, right?
Yes.
And also the title for the high priest isn't mentioned there.
Yeah.
um
So it's not the particular article of clothing that is unique to the high priest. It's the fact that the high priest once a year is the person who goes into the Holy of Holies and ministers on Yom Kippur, and only the high priest can do that. But concerning wearing the petalon or the sacerdotal plate, that would have been worn by any officiating priest, and that's suggested by the infancy Gospel of James.
yeah, so one thing that's interesting as well is, so this makes, if this is, an important person, right, and this author, and that he is an eyewitness now, right, that would give
Yes,
us an eyewitness testimony to these
yes.
things. It explains a lot why he's using certain language that he does, right?
Mm-hmm.
um but some of the pushback we get is that, for example, the reason why a lot of scholars are rejecting this inclusio eyewitness language on certain passages. I think it's John 21:25, where they basically say that, look, the Christology is too advanced for that
Yes.
time period. But it's
Yeah.
like, well, I mean, it seems like an assumption to me, but you point out, like, look at the Carmen Christi, right?
Yeah.
Like it's not too advanced for that time, and they have to presuppose that the term graphene, right,
Yeah.
is used of a remote
Remote
accusative
causative
case or
sense.
causative
Remote
case. Yes,
causative sense. Yeah. So there are two issues there. One is that the Christology is too advanced, and we know that not to be the case from, first of all, the pre Pauline material that Paul quotes. So there are several creeds and early Christian hymns formulated in the 30s that Paul quotes. One of the best known ones is the creed in 1 Corinthians 15, 3b to 6a and 7, concerning the witnesses to Jesus' resurrection. Another that is well known is in 1 Corinthians 11, dealing with the institution of the Lord's Supper. And a third would be the Christ hymn in Philippians chapter 2, where in the Christ hymn in Philippians 2, Jesus is identified as in the form of God, having the divine nature. He did not consider equality with God something to be exploited. He had it, but he didn't exploit it, but rather took on the nature of a servant, being made in human likeness, was crucified, and that God has now highly exalted him and given him the name that is above every name. In Jewish context, there's only one name that fits that bill. That's the name of Yahweh. So that at the name of Jesus, every knee would bow, heaven, earth, below the earth, and every tongue would confess. And that's a reference back to Isaiah chapter 45. That's a description that only applies to Yahweh. And so it says that Jesus Christ is Lord, and Lord, Kyrios, is the Septuagint translation of Yahweh. So explicitly they're identifying Jesus as Yahweh to the glory of God the Father. The fact that in the Epistle to the Romans, Paul in Romans 9:5 describes Jesus as God who is over all, forever praised. So certainly you don't get a higher Christology than that in the fourth gospel. You
correct.
have a Christology which is exactly parallel to it.
Yeah. And the other thing is, like, all right, so if you're just joining us, he's not arguing that this is John the Apostle, right? He's arguing that this would be John the Elder, who is the
Yes.
beloved. Okay, so just so there's no misunderstanding there. Now, I thought it was kind of funny though when you're talking about this phrase that's used, that this is the disciple who's testifying to these things and has written them. That you said a lot of the scholars just say, look, the word can, like you said, can be used in the causative case, but you quote Gottlob Schirink,
Yep.
that the
Shrinky. Mm-hmm.
Shrinky, that the beloved disciple and his recollections stand behind the gospel, are his occasion for writing, and that basically this just is saying that, hey, look, that he has some spiritual responsibility for what is contained in the book. But I thought the funny thing was you said that the major weakness of this view of this argument is just that there's no linguistic evidence that supports it. It's
Right,
just
right. In other words, it's just special pleading based on the fact that skeptical critics do not want for there to be an eyewitness that stands behind this text. And when the text flat out says, using the word graphine, which every single instance of graphine in Greek means either that you actually sat down and wrote the thing or that you dictated it to a scribe, there just is no such thing as a remote causative sense of graphine. Now, that doesn't stop people who already presuppose that the Gospel of John can't be historical from positing it, but it's special pleading and it needs to be called out as such.
sure. I understand that. So yeah, I mean, you say that means that he's not that far away from. It's either, at most, like a amanuensis can be used there, or
Right.
maybe a later student. I mean, what do you think about like the later redactor, the maybe a student or something like that.
No, that's not the way graphene is used. As I
No, no,
said,
I'm sorry.
yeah.
I meant like the form that we have today. Do you think
Well,
that?
even the
Yes.
form that we have today, there isn't any necessity for it. The only reason anyone might think that there would be a necessity for like a later um, person who knew John to come in after the elder John was dead is based on the word we, the interchange of I and we in John 21, that we know that his testimony is true. But the problem is that we know that when an author is trying to convey very strongly the truthfulness of what they're saying, they will use we, and that the we actually means I. It's just a forceful way of saying I. It's sort of the we of authoritative testimony, as Bauckham correctly
Right.
describes it. And
Yeah.
so once that is gone, then there's no reason at all to assume that there's some later disciple or that there's some later community. You would just take the text at its word that, yeah, this person is saying that I'm bearing definitive testimony to the fact that this is what I've seen.
Yeah. Then you use examples, parallels like Diamosthenes, to
Yes,
say that like, look, he uses it the same way.
yeah.
So
He
it's not
uses it
special
that
release.
way. And Josephus uses it that way when it's
Josephus.
talking about Joseph and Joseph being in prison, Joseph referring to himself as I and we when he's trying to convince the cupbearer not to forget him.
Correct, and that's Antiquity of the Jews 2.68 through 69, just so that people can, if they want to have the reference. Yeah, and so we have, sorry, next was going to be, so since this leaves only the author by process of elimination, the first person plural pronouns of this passage refers to the I writing the epistle, Jackson, 1999, page 13. This identification is further evidence, I and our, 3 John 9, I and us, 3 John 10, and we and I, 3
Yeah.
John 12 to 13.
So it's undisputed that the same John that wrote the Gospel of John wrote the Johannine letters. It's exactly the same literary style. And so when we see the author doing this over and over again, when the author wants to make a definitive statement that I am bearing authoritative witness, the author will use we just to drive that point home. And they'll interchange it with I, just like you have in John chapter 21.
Yeah, excuse me. So that's some of these are points that I'm just gonna be honest, I didn't think about. It's just something I didn't. I guess I guess it's more of a linguistic or grammatical
Mm-hmm.
thing that you wouldn't necessarily look for. And plus, I spend more of my time like looking at the Hebrew in the Old Testament. I'm just not as familiar with Greek. But you say like so when you're talking about the like this, you mentioned earlier the revolutionary kind of attitude, and I love how you go into the Second Temple period, because I just think people are way under familiar with it. And
Yes.
from another point in my life, I really had to go into some of that literature. And you talk about how they were expecting this revolutionary Messiah. They were
Yes.
expecting this person that was like going to take them and take the Jews to revolt against the Romans and take over, and then eventually be ruling right in the Romans' place. And
Yes.
so I love how you point to these different passages of Christ that we take for granted. Like if someone forces you to go 1 mile, go the second mile,
Yes.
where he's like saying, look, when this is a servant that's got to carry like a military backpack or something 1 mile or whatever the case, he's saying, look, don't just stop there and throw it down and be like, my job's over. I'm out of here.
Yeah.
Right. And then you point to like the render to Caesar what's Caesar's, as being kind of a play on what Judas Maccabeus' father
Yes.
said to him. Do you want to maybe mention that? Because I thought that was interesting.
Yeah. So Jesus' statement, render to Caesar what is Caesar's, or pay back to Caesar what is Caesar's, quite literally, and pay back to God what is God's. Any Jew listening to that would know the famous last words of Mattathias to his son, Judas Maccabeus, where Mattathias had been the original leader of the Maccabean revolt. And he's on his deathbed. And so he's trying to give Judas Maccabeus his marching orders on how to be a good Jewish revolutionary. And he says to him, pay back the Gentiles in their own coin and keep the commandments of God. Now, obviously, when Mattathias says pay back the Gentiles in their own coin, he doesn't mean pay them tax money. He means smash them to smithereens, obliterate them. Okay?
Hence the name
Jesus,
Maccabeus, right?
Yes. So Jesus is faced here with a challenge, a lose-lose situation. He's confronted by the Jewish religious authorities who say, shall we pay taxes to Caesar or not? If Jesus says, yes, we should pay taxes to Caesar, then Jesus will no longer be taken seriously by the crowds as a messianic claimant. But if he says, no, don't pay the tax, then the Romans are going to have him arrested as someone leading a tax revolt. And so Jesus ingeniously doesn't answer the question. Rather, he cites back Mattathias's words, pay back to Caesar what is Caesar's. Now, what does that mean when you're staring at a tax coin? If Jesus had said that off the top of his head in Galilee, it would have been taken as an open call to revolution. But once you're looking at a tax coin, you really don't know what it means. And that's the point, that who knows? But he wants you to focus on the key part and pay back to God what is God's. Render to God what is God's. In other words, be the people of God. Be the kingdom people that Jesus has been calling them to be throughout his entire ministry.
Yeah, I thought that was very interesting because it's almost like when Judas Maccabeus' father, Matthias, right, told him,
Yes.
he was kind of giving him like a last will and testament kind of speech, right?
Yeah.
Where he's like, look, give to the Romans, pay them back in their own coin. It's almost like give them a dose of their own medicine.
Exactly.
Right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And for him, it would have been the Syrians, not the Romans. But yes.
Oh, yeah, sorry. Yeah, Syrian. Sorry. Thanks for correcting me on that. But in Christ's day, when he's saying this, he's like, give to Caesar what's Caesar's. Well, to his Jewish audience, that could just mean like, oh, he's down for the cause almost. But to the Romans, it's like, oh, he's saying just pay taxes. So it's almost like an in between. Is that right, or am I misunderstanding?
Yeah, it's a statement where it's intentionally worded to avoid the issue because he knows that's what they're trying to trap him on.
And since they're expecting him,
they want him to come down on one side or the other, and Jesus is saying, no, I'm not playing that game. Take that for whatever you want it to mean, but the real point I want to focus in on is pay back what God deserves.
Yeah, give God what, yeah.
Yes.
And so in that sense, because the reason why they're interested in that is because they're expecting somebody like Judas Maccabeus or the Hasmonean dynasty to come back and give them a dose of their own medicine, right?
Right.
So that's really interesting. One other point is about the Sadducean calendar usage. So this is something that comes up in textual criticism, right, about John's Gospel, about the night of the Passover. Do you want to explain this a little bit about the Sadducean calendar instead of the popular Pharisaic calendar?
Yeah, so the popular Pharisaic calendar would have located the day of the Passover on what we would call Maundy Thursday. And then the Sadducean calendar would have located the day of the Passover on what we might call Holy Saturday. And when you look at the Gospel of John, it clearly reflects the Sadducean calendar because you've got the whole motive for Nicodemus and for Joseph of Arimathea to want to make sure that Jesus is buried before sundown on Friday is because the next day is not only the Sabbath, but the next day is, on their view, as members of the Sanhedrin and therefore priests, as the most prominent day of the year. It's the Passover, not just any old Sabbath. And according to Deuteronomy chapter 23, anyone who was hung on a tree was thought to, if they were not buried before the sunset, they were considered to defile the land. And so these Jewish religious authorities would not have wanted the land defiled on any Sabbath at all, much less on the Passover, according to their reckoning. And so that's the prime motive for their asking to have the body of Jesus and to see that Jesus is buried.
Yeah, so I want to leave a little bit of time for Q&A at the end, but I did have about 400 more questions for you. But I did want to give you time at the end as well to do like a little summary. But I wanted to ask you this. Sorry, I'm trying to pick and choose like what I would. So I guess I actually. Okay. Are you pressed for time? Like, how much time would you say you had left if we want to do like Q&A or something?
I probably got as much time as you need.
Okay. I didn't know if you were pressed for time today or not. So I wanted to get back to the Carmen Christi for a minute, Philippians chapter 2, right? Because so a lot of translations will say something like he didn't see it, the equality he had with God is something to be grasped, for and things like this. So he humbled himself. The translation you use says exploited. But it's like when I'm talking to Unitarians and some non-believers just in general, they'll try and use this early hymn in an odd way, right? So I'll say Christ, although he existed in the form of God, did not see the equality he had with God something to be held on, grasped at, or exploited. I think would probably be a good phrase there. But emptied himself, taking on the form of a human, even in the likeness of a servant, right, to the death on the cross and so forth.
Yeah.
And then, so I'll tell you a few things I've gotten. I want your response to them, right? So the other night I had a Unitarian telling me, well, then what do you think the morphe or the form of God is? That's just means, like, they're basically arguing that it means something like just being in the image of God the same way a regular person is, and that it's not God in that sense. Like, what do you say about that use of the form?
Well, morphe theou, morphe is an ontological term. It describes the form in the Platonic sense of the word. It's talking about having the nature of. So when you hear form, you've got to hear that with all of the Platonic resonances of form. I mean, when Plato was talking about the form of something, such as the form of the good, he's talking about the good itself. Any reader of Plato knows that. And so he's talking about the morphe agathos there in his writings. Well, similarly, when the Christ hymn refers to the pre-incarnate Jesus as in the morphe theos, it means that Jesus is in the form of God in exactly the same way as the form of the good is the good. So Jesus is in the form of God insofar as Jesus has the very nature of God, the very essence of God. And then it goes on to say that he did not consider equality with God as something to be exploited. And the correct translation, as has been shown in a wide number of articles, and it's in terms of translations, that's the way the latest rendering of the NIV has it. That's the way the New Revised Standard has it. So it shouldn't be controversial across, say, liberal conservative theological lines. That's standard. That you have to have something in order to be able to exploit it. The point is, he has the form of God. He has the nature of God, just as the form of the good is the good, but doesn't exploit it, takes the form of a servant. And then, of course, at the end, when it says that Jesus has the name that is above every name, which is the name of Yahweh, and even the Yahweh proof text from Isaiah 45:23 is cited about every knee should bow and every tongue confess. To try to say that Jesus is not God based on that text is just barking up the wrong tree. So I've had this conversation with Jehovah's Witnesses, and it's rather curious.
Yeah, and so I'll tell you another thing they try to do is, like, I'll have people talking about this exploited, grasped at language, and they'll say, well, look at this. Look at the sense that it's used in like robbing, right? So basically, Christ was like a lower. He was defined. They'll go that far. They'll be like they'll get rid of the first argument. And they'll say, well, he was divine, but he was a lower form of divinity, and he wasn't like Satan who wanted to ascend on high. So he wasn't trying to rob God of his seed, right? And so they'll use that. Um, but yeah, I mean,
Yeah,
yeah,
that older argument based on harpagmon there is discredited in the literature on that term, and therefore, if you look up the most recent grammars, such as um, Joannes Lau and Eugene Nida's Greek English lexicon of the New Testament based on semantic domains, they explicitly state this word means to take advantage of. It means to exploit. It doesn't mean to grasp at something that you do not possess. So that's really the key. If someone insists that that's what it means, then I would just challenge them. All right, where in Koine Greek literature do you find an example of harpagmos being used in that way? And the answer is crickets, because there isn't one. But yeah.
Well, I found it interesting because Bart Ehrman, it seems to me like he tries to stay away from this passage because every time I've heard it brought up to him, he says, "Well, I'm not really interested in that so much." Like he did that in his debate with Bob Price, where it was brought up to him, and he basically said he wasn't interested really in answering that question about the Carmen Christi. But then he did say, "But I see it." I think he said something like, "I see this as Christ was like an angel before, or whatever." And I thought that was a little odd. That
Yeah. And the thing is, and this gets into another chapter in the book, that doesn't help. That response doesn't help because, yes, you could say, and this was a way that many of the early church fathers thought of Jesus. Now, Jehovah's Witnesses will hear this and use this and misconstrue it. But in the Hebrew Bible, you have this character, the angel of Yahweh. And Hebrew Bible scholars are virtually unanimous, if not unanimous, that the angel of Yahweh just is another way of saying Yahweh. And so the early church fathers identified Jesus as the angel of Yahweh in that same sense. And I make the argument in one of the chapters of the book that in John 8, one of the claims that Jesus is making is to be one of the three quote unquote men who came to visit Abraham during the theophany of Genesis chapter 18, and then later returned a year later when Sarah gave birth to Isaac. So there, Jesus is talking to the Jewish religious leaders, and he says to them, you're not children of God. If you were children of God, you wouldn't be trying to kill me. A man who has told you the truth that he has heard from God, that I have heard from God. You know, Abraham didn't do this. And the clear reading of that, what did Abraham not do? Well, grammatically, it's that Abraham did not try to kill Jesus. And that raises the interesting question. When did Abraham ever have an opportunity to kill Jesus? And it can't be during any of the glorious theophanies, because there would be no attempt to like try to put Jesus out of his misery, say in Genesis chapter 12 or Genesis chapter 15 or something like that. And the only two candidates that you can identify is either that Jesus is identifying himself with Melchizedek in Genesis chapter 14, or that Jesus is one of the three, quote, men who certainly appeared mortal from the fact that two of them, the men of Sodom, tried to rape them in Genesis chapter 19. Those would be the options that you're limited to. And then when you look at the Greek terminology that's used later on in John 8:56, where it talks about your father Abraham rejoiced to see my day, he saw it and was glad. And you look at the Septuagint and where exactly those same verbs are used, they're used not in the Melchizedek passage, but in the passage concerning the three men and the three men's return in granting the request of Sarah to give birth to Isaac. So there, Jesus is claiming to be one of the quote unquote angels, if you might call it that, who appeared to Abraham in Genesis chapter 18. But collectively, those three are referred to as Yahweh, as God. And so I'm careful when I talk about that, because Jehovah's Witnesses have a completely different meaning. They're like, oh yeah, Jesus is Michael the Archangel. No. That's not what it's saying.
Yeah. Well,
also,
yeah, go ahead. Did you want to finish?
And also in Jehovah's Witnesses literature, which I think I have almost every piece of Jehovah's Witness literature that's been published. Every time I move to a new place, which fortunately I won't have to do anymore, but when I used to have to move around, whenever I went to a new place, I would put my address on the Jehovah's Witnesses mailing list, and knowing that they would come to my house. And so it's interesting that they are fond of quoting early church fathers in like their book, Should You Believe in the Trinity? And they say, oh, well, this early church father talks about Jesus' angel and Jesus' angel. But when you actually look up the passages and quote them back, it's clear they're talking about the angel of Yahweh, who they identify as Yahweh, which is not some subordinate being like Michael the Archangel.
Correct. And the other thing is like, oh, well, you should know this as well. Is all of my audience are like, we're huge Dr. Michael Heiser fans. So we are completely familiar with that kind of world, and we know there's a difference. The Old Testament Elohim to the New Testament writers use angel in kind of a general way, but as Heiser points out, that angel means messenger, right? But there's other, say, occupations or something to that effect, right? That are different from just angel. There's like a hierarchy. Archangel, you have the Elohim, you have the seraphim and cherubim, and so anyway. But yeah, that gets used a lot. Those types of arguments. I think that one of the issues with this passage is that it looks so it's so early, right? Because this is Paul quoting an early church.
Yeah, Paul quoting it. Yeah, it comes from the 30s. That's unanimous.
And I think one of the issues is we have something coming from so early, where this advanced Christology is what some people would say a high view.
Yeah.
But an advanced Christology here, right? And so that gets back to our point. This was already around. So it's not like John, if he was an eyewitness, couldn't have had a high Christology or an advanced Christology, right? And so is there anything else about that point about how scholars will take something like their assumption of because they want to use Markan priority, right? And they want to move down the list and say, well, look at John, it's really advanced in Christology, so it's way too late. And you want to say anything about that kind of method?
Well, that view completely ignores the Pauline evidence and the pre-Pauline evidence. That's the overarching problem with that view. So even if you accept, as I do, the standard dating of the Gospels, so I'm not one of the people who early dates the Gospels. I accept the normal scholarly dating that Mark is around 68, that Luke is around 80, that Matthew's around 85, John is between 85 and 90, probably closer to 90. But first of all, in the Pauline evidence, you clearly have just as advanced Christology as you have in the Gospel of John and earlier still. And second, takes a pretty odd reading to read Mark and conclude that Mark didn't think that he was dealing with God incarnate here, or Matthew or Luke. You've got to jump over a lot of stuff and explain away a lot of different passages. So if you're reading Mark, you've got to try to say, okay, somehow he's not divine, but he's Lord of the Sabbath. Somehow he's not divine, but he can actually say that Moses got it wrong when he gave the command about divorce, and that did not represent God's will. He's claiming to be in the place of God. when he's asked by the rich young man, "Good teacher, what must I do to inherit eternal life?" Jesus does not deny that he is good. He rather says, "Why do you call me good? No one is good except God alone," hoping the young man will put two and two together. Just to make sure the point is driven home, when the young man inquires as to what commandments he ought to keep, Jesus intentionally quotes the whole second table of the law, right? Our obligations to our fellow human beings, the horizontal aspect of the law. But he's left out the whole first table of the law, our obligations to God. And when Jesus tries to explain what it is that this man needs to do, he says, "I've done all these horizontal things concerning my fellow human beings. What do I still lack?" Well, what he still lacks is obvious, that he needs to have Yahweh as his only God. He needs not to have idols and so on. And Jesus says, here's the paraphrase of that: "Come and follow me." Exactly when you expect Jesus to say, "Come and follow Yahweh." No, "Come follow me." That's
Yeah.
glaringly obvious. Or
Yeah.
when Jesus quotes Psalm 110:1, or when Jesus calls himself the Son of Man in Daniel's vision. So you just got to pretend all those things aren't there to make this argument work.
Right. And so I was trying to remember. Isn't the well, actually, what I was going to say before was even Ehrman recently has said some comments that he made on like a podcast where he said, "Look, I do think that that Mark thought Christ was God."
Yeah.
I'm like, there. I mean, that's clear. Like if he says, then great. Um, you, one thing I want to do, I wanted to say was, you point out this list that designates John, the son of Zebedee. I believe this is in John chapter 21.
Yeah. John chapter 21.
The Apostle John's already listed as one of the sons of Zebedee.
Yes.
We find here, in addition, an indication that the beloved disciple is a different person than the Apostle John.
Yes.
So, because a lot of people, whenever I first put out that I was going to have you on, I had people pushing back, and a lot of people said about the elder John is people were saying, well, I think most people just think that the elder John and the Apostle John are the same. It's I'm not in the layman world, I guess.
Right.
And you're saying here, like, look, there's just so many. There are multiple reasons to think that that's not the same person. This is another example of that.
Right.
Also, you say that. Oh, sorry. The other thing I want to talk about is the revolutionary versus the way faith is perceived. Okay, because this is in another chapter, but I think it's going to relate to really how you perceive the whole gospel. Because if they're expecting this great revolutionary leader that's going to help them to overthrow Rome and become, and Christ is like basically all of his sayings are saying like, no, that's not what the Messiah is supposed to come for.
Yes.
And when you talk about faith, you kind of you use the wedding at Cana as an analogy, right? And I want to talk about how you view that. But I like this language, right, of your is because you can think about it in a sense of because there's this debate, right, about once saved, always saved, about the works versus faith, salvation. And if you think about it like that as a revolutionary leader, or as a leader in general, if you think about today, Russia and Ukraine, if somebody's puts their faith in the Ukrainian leader to lead them, then they can, what they're doing is they're making a commitment, or like they're kind of pledging their allegiance to this person. But if they were to, if Russia comes over the line and captures them, right, and they just turn, well, they obviously weren't committed, right? So that's kind of how I see the works coming off in your view, is something like, it's not the works that save us, right? It's that if if we pledge our allegiance to Christ, and yet we send a message to the enemies and say, like, here's where he is, then our works isn't in line with our actual allegiance. It's not just intellectual assent, right? It's not just because the demons believe, right, and tremble.
Right,
So,
right.
um,
So
yeah,
yeah,
you want to mention?
the
Go ahead.
thesis, one key thesis is that when the Gospel of John uses the phrase pisteuo eis plus the accusative, that's believe in or believe into plus the accusative, that is intentionally constructed by the author of the Gospel of John to denote a personal commitment to Jesus, a commitment of allegiance, fidelity, love, and trust. You're pledging your life, your love, your commitment to Jesus, to be a follower of his. So it's not like believing various facts about Jesus or giving intellectual assent to Jesus. You certainly are doing that, but it's far more than that. It's exactly the same type of language that you would expect to accompany a wedding. So the way the Gospel of John crafts this is by putting this in context of a wedding celebration, where the wedding between the two actual individuals, it's interesting, we don't know who the two actual individuals are because they're irrelevant to John's purpose. So Jesus and his disciples and Mary were invited to this wedding, and John goes to great pains to, whenever you would expect for the mother of the groom to be spoken about, it's Mary who is spoken about, not the actual mother of the person who's getting physically married. And then they have a problem. There's not enough wine. Well, in a Jewish wedding, that was the groom's responsibility. But it doesn't go to the actual physical groom, that Mary, as the mother of the bride, would be expected to do, to go to her son, to go to the real groom and say, they don't have any wine. Mary goes to Jesus and does exactly this. Jesus provides the wine, thereby showing his glory. And when the person is praised, it says, most people have left the poor wine until, after the guests have become well drunk, but you have kept the best wine until now. Yes, they're praising the groom, but they're praising the wrong groom. The actual groom who did this is in fact Jesus. And then just when you would expect in the language of marriage for it to say that the husband believed into his wife, made a personal commitment to his wife, or his wife believed into her husband, made a personal commitment to him, it says that his disciples pisteuo eis auton, his disciples believed into him in that fidelity sense, that they pledged their allegiance to him. They vowed their life, their love, their allegiance to him. And that's really the essence of saving faith. And it's for that reason that saving faith naturally gives rise to works. If I'm sincere when I married my wife around 14 years ago, obviously that's going to bear fruit in various works. I'm going to do various things that express that I'm married to her. And if I don't do those things, then it's pretty obvious that, I never had the commitment to start out with. And so that really is the relationship between faith and works. There isn't any contradiction between John and the synoptics, as some critics have imagined. There have been many critics who have said, oh, John just requires faith, by which they mean intellectual assent, just belief. Whereas in the synoptics, it's about discipleship, and that you've got to be willing to lay down your life for Jesus and even leave family behind. And the point is, no, John is saying exactly the same thing, that pisteuo eis auton, that's carefully constructed to mean the commitment that a husband and a bride would have for each other. And that later on in the narrative of John, when John the Baptist is asked about Jesus, what does he say? He says that Jesus is the groom and that the groom has the bride. And he says, I'm not the groom. And therefore I rejoice when the groom gets more attention than I do. I'm the friend of the groom who rejoices to see him being united with the bride. And then his language about the grooms having the bride is directly oppositional grammatically to the statement about our believing in him in John 3:16. So from the groom's perspective, Jesus' perspective, the groom has the bride. From our perspective, we believe in Jesus. In other words, we pledge our life, our love, our commitment to Jesus.
Right. And so I found this really interesting because the way you explained it is so it's like the marriage at that point, right? The mother was the one kind of organizing the weddings.
Yes, yes.
Okay. And the mother of the groom, right? And so
Mm-hmm.
in this case, it's almost like a double entendre almost where they're
Yes, it's
kind
a
of
double entendre.
okay, great, great. Where they're saying like that Christ is the groom, right?
Yes.
And he's showing his glory to the
Mm-hmm.
church being the bride, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so it's like it's using this language about this marriage to help the church to understand what faith is going to be, what it's like, right? What it belief in Christ is like, right? It's like making
Yes.
this commitment in a
Right,
marriage.
right.
And I think that's beautiful because a lot of people are going to say something like, or I should say, a lot of average, like normal normies that aren't that familiar with. They have a more of a crayon Christianity, as Craig might put
Uh-huh.
it, right? View, where they're going to say like, well, no, you just believe like I believe God exists and Jesus is God or something. I believe that, so I'm good to go. But rather, it's that you're like, but at the first sign of something going wrong, they're just gonna abandon it and be like, oh, this one intellectual thing that I hadn't looked into, I was wrong about it. I guess it's all wrong, right? And in that sense, you can't just abandon a marriage because all of a sudden.
Right, right, right. Oh, my wife and I need an argument. Well, that's the end of that. No, no marriage would survive if that were the case.
That's why I like this so much is the way that you put it. Also, it goes along with a lot of the research I've been doing on a project I've been doing about in Leviticus, but that's something I'll say for another time. But in relation to that, in the same chapter, you talk about Jesus giving his mother to John to
Yes,
in his putting her in his care. Now, this would
yes,
make sense if the beloved disciple was somebody that was important or wealthy, right? Somebody that had the means to take care of his mother and
yeah,
somebody that he trusted,
right,
right?
right, right.
But also, he says to his like, take your mother, here's your mother, and here's your
Yeah,
son, to the
right.
mother and to the beloved disciple. But last thing here is that you give an example from Tobit that where Tobias he gives, I believe it's his, what was it, his daughter Sarah in marriage, and he says, take your kinswoman now,
Yes,
for now are you are her brother, and she let's see, and she's your sister, right?
yes, yes.
So this goes along with what I've been kind of working on about the inheritance of Israel in Leviticus and
Hmm.
how um, you become part of a household and so forth. So why don't you tell us a little bit about this whole view of giving somebody as a family member? It's like adoption language.
Yeah, it is. It is like adoption language. And one thing that's important about the Gospel of John to play off of that is that when it describes our relationship with God, I argue that our relationship with God is that of not sons and daughters of God by nature, but sons and daughters of God by adoption. And it's interesting that that lines up perfectly well with what Paul says in Romans chapter 8 about the spirit within us is the spirit of adoption who cries out, Abba, Father. So when we are adopted into God's family, we don't take on the nature of God. Word faith teachers would say that we do. I was listening to word faith teachers for about an hour last night for entertainment purposes, but they would say that we do, but we do not. We are adopted children of God. But in terms of ontological equality, it's the Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit who have that. Um, but we have a relational unity with the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit as God's adopted children. And that language of becoming part of a family is extremely important in the familial system of the Greco-Roman world, and John uses it in order to portray believers' relationship to God as well.
Correct. Yeah. I listened to a lecture series by Dale Martin at Yale where he talks about, and he writes about this as well, about it's interesting that we think of like modern slavery, right, as how bad and horrible, right? And he said, look, I'm gonna just tell you up front, just take this, try to take it lightly or something. But then he says, look, for the people that were good people, this was actually a means of upward mobility for servants, right? Because you could actually give them a part of your business, and if you manumitted them, then they could sign contracts and stuff for you. They became part of your household, and so he was saying, look, the whole system was pretty terrible. He said, but the only thing there was that if you took them a part of your household and then manumitted them, that they could actually um, sign documents and run a
Yes,
like part of your business and so
right,
forth.
right.
And so it was a way for somebody to have upward mobility. But that was interesting, I thought. And so I get a lot of this adoption language from the Old Testament. So I guess now we'll turn to Q&A. I have so many other questions I want to ask you about this chapter and others, but so let's just turn there first because we had quite a few questions come in. I don't want to keep you all day. I want to respect your time. So we have Spartan saying, I'm reading J. Lewis Martin's book on John. What does Dr. MacGregor think about his idea that Gospel of John is a two-level drama?
I think the view is too complex to be plausible. It's not the type of view that one, either on a reading of the text in Greek just on its face, or even when you compare the Gospel of John to dramatic literature, you wouldn't normally think of the Gospel being some two-level drama. That's not something that sticks out. It seems to me that that view depends on the notion that something other than historical interests are driving this text. And if you think that an eyewitness source stands behind it, and the fact that it's so different from the synoptics doesn't do anything to disqualify its historicity, if John is giving us the Jerusalem portrayal of what Jesus did over a 3.5-year period, and the synoptics are giving us largely the Galilean portrayal, of course they would be different. And we know from sources in the ancient world that when you have independent accounts of people like Julius Caesar or the Emperor Nero or Tiberius, that those accounts differ much more markedly than do the synoptics in the Gospel of John. So to try to say one is historical and the other is not, I think is wrong. And also, I think that two-level drama view doesn't take into account that there's good reason to believe that what we now have as the Gospel of John is kind of the second version, that the original version was what scholars identify today as the sign source. And by almost all scholars' admission who work on the sign source, in other words, people who wouldn't believe this would say they don't think the sign source existed. But if you think it existed, it's going to be dated somewhere in the 60s. And the sign source would have contained basically these 8 semia or signs of Jesus. And these signs, if you piece together doing textual studies what the sign source would have included, it seems specifically geared toward a Jewish audience. And that would make sense if the first draft of the Gospel of John, we might say anachronistically, was proposed for a Jewish audience. But once the temple was destroyed in the year 70 after the Roman-Jewish War, and this same author, the elder John, is writing for a Gentile audience, then he needs to take that material and ultimately reshape it so that they can understand it. and oftentimes inserts all sorts of phrases and definitions that are clearly intended for someone not familiar with Judaica to be able to understand what's going on. So the fact that it seems like a strained view if you assume historicity, number one, and the fact, number two, that it seems not to give adequate attention to the likely historical process by which this gospel was written. That's why I would prefer my view to this two-level drama view.
Okay, yeah. So that's interesting because I'm not really well researched on that view. So I'm glad to hear about it. Oh, actually, I forgot a question I was going to ask. So I'm going to actually, sorry, you guys want to get back to one of my questions. So you mentioned the criterion of dissimilarity and the
Yes.
criterion of embarrassment and a few
Yes.
others in the book, right? But I wanted to bring this up because in our community, you got to understand we are in the trenches debating atheists and agnostics and pantheists and all these other different groups, right? So we hear a lot from the non-believers, especially in the atheist type communities, right, that the criterion of embarrassment is not used by scholars. That's just something that Christian scholars use, right? And then here's the other part of it is Bart Ehrman was asked about it, and he didn't reject it, but he said something like, and I'm just going off memory here, something like, yeah, I just think that it breaks down into the criterion of dissimilarity. What do you have to say about first how it does it relate or break down into the criterion of dissimilarity, and then secondly, what about this claim that scholars don't use it only in Christian works?
Well, I can say that I received my doctoral training from the University of Iowa, and it most certainly is used by scholars as a standard device for historicity, that if a detail is counterproductive or embarrassing for its author or would not serve the author's purposes, then that's a positive argument in favor of that thing's being historical. And if you were to take historiography from any other period, that's taken as a commonsensical point, even in courts of law today. If you have someone making a statement against penal interest, you know that statement is true. You know it's historical because they would have every motive not to say it. So whether you're dealing with New Testament history, whether you're dealing with history before that, whether you're dealing with medieval history, early modern history today, that criteria holds good. So honestly, you're the first person I've heard to suggest that only Christians have come up with the criteria of embarrassment. Absolutely not. That can be found in all sorts of textbooks on historiography, which are not even addressing the biblical world. That's just a standard historical criterion.
Yeah, I don't think they say that like only Christians came up with it, but more that it's like nobody really uses that more because it's not really significant in telling you indicating historical facts. But I'm like you, that's why I asked, because I'm like, what if somebody says something like most of the apostles, one apostle or disciple denied knowing him, one betrayed him, sold him out, stuff like this. I'm like, that does make it seems to add to it the plausibility.
I'll give you two uncontroverted examples from the 16th century. So the Anabaptist reformer Balthasar Hubmaier, one of the most important Anabaptist theologians, there are references in his letters to how he renounced his belief in believers' baptism and under torture said that no, infant baptism is really the right thing to do. And this would have proved devastating in the Anabaptist community, where several other Anabaptists were giving up their life for the conviction of believers' baptism and the church-state separation that it implied. And for Hubmaier, one of these leaders, to admit that under torture, that he had this moment, which he thought of as kind of his Simon Peter moment, like I'm denying Jesus. And he said, I'm never going to do that again. We only know about that from Hubmaier, but no scholar of the Anabaptist movement or of the Reformation doubts that that happened, because there's no way that Hubmaier would have invented that he did that unless he actually had. Or to give another example, Martin Luther talking in his writings about Philip of Hesse being allowed to practice bigamy. Nobody thinks that, oh, well, maybe Martin Luther never really did that. You know, of course he did. We know that he did, because otherwise he never would have admitted it. That's absolutely counterproductive to the reforms that he's trying to engineer. So, yes, the criterion of embarrassment is one of, I think, the most obvious criteria in any period of ancient history or modern history.
Yeah, I mean, it just seems to be, obvious. I'm like, it's going to contribute to the plausibility of, like,
Yes.
So anyway, all right, let's get back to the question. Sorry, I had to say that. And then the other thing about it basically just dissolving into the criterion of dissimilarity.
Yeah,
I'm not sure where he got that.
Yeah, I mean, that doesn't really help any, because he recognizes the criterion of dissimilarity is legitimate. He uses it all the time in his book on the historical Jesus. So I don't get that, but I think conceptually it's different from the criterion of embarrassment. Criterion of embarrassment is essentially saying there's nothing either before the alleged event occurred, while the alleged event occurred, or after the alleged event occurred from which you could make this up. That's the point of the criterion of dissimilarity. And that's a different thing than saying that it's embarrassing. It might be utterly dissimilar to anything that's past, present, or future, but still not embarrassing.
Yeah, and I would even give it to you, like, you could reject something that is as not meeting the criterion of embarrassment because some new evidence or something tells you that this wasn't that embarrassing. Like,
yes, you could.
I see in Dr. Who is it, Robert Spencer's book where he wrote Did Muhammad Exist, where he basically says, like, he tries to conclude that Muhammad never existed, but he did a debate with David Wood where he said something. David kept using the criterion of embarrassment, like, oh, look, would he, would they say this about him, about his bride, or would they say this about, and it seems embarrassing, so they wouldn't have wrote the details. But then he pushed back and said, like, yeah, well, that seems embarrassing to us, but that might not have seemed embarrassing to them. And so I can see somebody rejecting that criterion on a case because of something like that. But in that case, it just doesn't qualify, right?
Right, it just wouldn't qualify. So criterion of embarrassment, we're not talking about what would be embarrassing to me or to 21st century readers. What we're asking about is embarrassment to the original audience. So there are several things in the Gospels that pass the criterion of embarrassment that would not be embarrassing to us, such as the empty tomb being discovered by women witnesses. That would have been horribly awkward for the early Christian community, but would not be in any way awkward to us today. We would say, why is that in any way important?
Yeah, great. I agree. Let's get to the next question. And by the way, I use your 1 Corinthians article all the time. I'm always using that.
Oh, well, thank you. I'm glad to hear that's pretty.
I love it. Yeah, I actually have Dr. Allison Barr's book, or Beth Allison Barr's book, The Making of Biblical Womanhood, and she actually uses that argument in the book, but it's by I think there was somebody that kind of it seemed to me that you and this other person that was from like the 70s or something, I want to say, you kind of did like the Plantinga and Molina view, right, where he kind of came about it independently from a different point of view kind of thing. But yeah, she uses his argument, which is pretty much the same as that. He's quoting this and refuting this thing, but very interesting. So, and I'll link everything in the description. But our next question is from Travis Lee. He says, hey, Converse, when you get, near the end, I guess this is a little off topic, but we mentioned it at the beginning. He says, what about the objection that the biblical author wouldn't have conceived of middle knowledge?
Yeah, well, I grant that the biblical author didn't conceive of middle knowledge, but that's not the question I'm asking. The question I'm asking is, how can it be true that these things that the author says are the case? How can it be true that God chooses only some people to be saved, that people have the freedom to either say yes or to no to Jesus, and that God desires all people to be saved? How can those simultaneously be true? And what I'm saying is, the Gospel of John doesn't connect the dots. It doesn't give us a philosophical framework for explaining how those things can be true. But middle knowledge does provide that kind of philosophical framework. And so the questioner is correct that John would not have had the doctrine of middle knowledge in mind. Far from it. But I'm just saying that middle knowledge nicely solves this quandary that John has given us.
Yeah, correct. So, I mean, and it just seems like something like, well, if the text is underdetermined on certain views, right? But there are...
Right. In other words, the Gospel of John is not trying to provide a philosophical treatise on the nature of predestination and human freedom. The author of the Gospel of John is trying to write a biography about Jesus, an ancient biography.
Right. So it just doesn't, it's not intended to do that. And so that makes sense. Our next question comes from Spartan again. He says, does Dr. MacGregor address the claims that Gospel of John has clear anachronisms, like how the Jewish leaders threatened to kick people from the synagogue even before the crucifixion?
Yes, and
You actually do.
And my argument is that those are not anachronisms, that the idea that those are clear anachronisms, to me, makes no sense, because think of the situation that the Jewish religious leaders were in after the destruction of the temple, after Jerusalem's devastation by the Romans in 70, when they're dispersed. Are they going to have any control whatsoever over what's happening in the Ephesian community? It seems obviously not. Where the Jewish authorities are going to have this degree of control is in the pre-70 scenario, just as you see with the Sanhedrin being opposed to the early Jesus movement in the book of Acts. So in the book of Acts, you find that the Sanhedrin tries to arrest the apostles, that they confront the apostles about not preaching in Jesus' name, that Saul, on behalf of the Sanhedrin, leads the first Judea and Galilee-wide official Sanhedrin persecution of Jesus followers, that people who are in the synagogues who believe in Jesus as Messiah are literally being forced, dragged off into chains, brought to Jerusalem, tried, and Paul is casting his vote against them to put them to death. That's what's happening in the 30s and in the 40s and in the 50s and in the 60s. We know from Josephus in 62 that James and several other disciples were stoned to death by the Sanhedrin. That's the attitude of terror that bathes the fourth gospel, is what's going on before 70. But after 70, when the Jewish authorities have lost all of their power, they don't have the authority to do the kind of things that the Gospel of John is imagining. So people who say that this is an anachronism, I just directly challenge that and say, no, the evidence points in the opposite direction.
Very interesting. Yeah, and I loved your stuff about the Second Temple period. A lot of the things that, some things I had never considered about, the passages about the mother of the children and her. Did she choose to love the children, or does she choose to tell them, like, to care for the children, I guess, and not have them be tortured, or have them disobey God, and that makes sense of other passages, and that's something we'll get to in other chapters. I want to have Kirk back to talk about some of the other chapters as well. This next question: does Dr. MacGregor think that the author of Gospel of John knew the synoptics?
No, I do not. And I make that case in chapter 2 of the book. So I side with those who believe that the author of the Gospel of John did not know the synoptics, that John would be certainly on my dating that the Gospel of Mark would have been a little bit later than the sign source, but that Mark probably its provenance was in Rome, and with Matthew's provenance probably being someplace like Antioch and Luke's provenance being Rome, that was geographically isolated enough from Ephesus that, especially if the Gospel of John in its second edition is being written at the same time as Matthew and Luke, there isn't any reason to think that the author of John knew the synoptics. And there are only a handful of examples that people have tried to argue that saying, oh, here you have Johannine knowledge of the synoptics. And in chapter 2, I try to show that the evidence points in the opposite direction, that those arguments are quite strained, to put it mildly.
Okay. Yeah, so Spartan actually said the anachronisms in John are the biggest reason for rejecting a traditional authorship. That's why I mentioned during the show, I said he doesn't believe John the Apostle and John the Elder are the same. So when we talk about traditional, yeah, go ahead.
And so I'm wondering what anachronisms are there. Right. That would be exactly my challenge. I don't see anachronisms in John. Certainly, I do see statements that require that the Gospel of John that we have is a reworked version, such as parenthetical remarks about why the Jews used the stone jars of water for purification, or the meaning of the term Christos, or the meaning of the term Mashiach, that it means the same as Christos, or the several other references that the author tries to give to acquaint Jewish readers, or to acquaint Gentile readers with practices of Judaica. But the problem is, if you isolate the passages from the sign source, from sort of the final product of the Gospel of John, they have exactly the same literary features. You would say that the only supposition that makes sense is that it's the same author who's responsible for both sources. So if you see the Gospel of John being composed in two stages, the first stage being the sign source stage, which is intended for a Jewish audience in the 60s, and then later on, the Gospel of John material is added to make it accessible to a Gentile audience in around 90, then you I don't think, have any anachronisms. So that's, and in terms of traditional authorship versus not, the sense in which I would say that I'm not holding to traditional authorship is if by tradition you mean what people started to believe in the 3rd century and forward. Sure. But in terms of the 1st century or the 2nd century, I wouldn't be rejecting that tradition at all. Yeah. I'd be right on line with that tradition.
Right, because you make that argument in the book about, you go through Papias, Irenaeus, and Poly.
Yes.
How do you say Polycrates? Sorry.
Yes.
Polycrates, yeah, is that what you say?
Yes.
Okay. And you talk about how you even, and again, it's not that he hasn't read some of these other works. It's like the book is just full of citations. Like it's similar to a Heiser book, right? In that sense. And he goes through some of the arguments against. So he says, like, here's what people think about Irenaeus, what he's saying. But if you actually look at the way that Irenaeus' context, how he uses the term apostle, for example, right? He's not using it in that same way.
Yes.
So,
yes.
Yeah. So anyway, I just wanted to mention that you actually do handle some of the objections in the book. So you should get the book and maybe have them on your show one day. But just what you're saying about the sources and about the Jewishness of some source, our next question was actually from Brute Facts podcast. He says, can you talk about the Jewishness of John? I have heard that it is far more Jewish than usually attributed.
Yes. The Jewishness of the Gospel of John, especially when you separate out the signs material, which I propose would have been specifically addressed to a Jewish audience, it makes perfectly good sense. It fits perfectly within Judaism, and the closest parallels we find to many of the themes in the Gospel of John, like light versus darkness, and themes such as the resurrection on the last day, and those who have done good raised to a resurrection of life, those who have done evil rise to a resurrection of judgment. Those are themes which you can find in the Dead Sea Scrolls in spades. So certainly before the Dead Sea Scrolls, it was easy for people to try to dismiss the Jewishness of John and to say, well, yes, John does have a lot of relationships to Philo in terms of closeness, but Philo's sort of a weird Jew. You know, he's sort of a Hellenized Jew, so that doesn't count. But once the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered, that argument goes out the window, because we see how all of these categories, which scholars had proposed really bizarre explanations for, like a Mandean source or a Gnostic source, that all of these were stock in trade in the Jewish worldview of the Dead Sea Scrolls. So also the way even the word hoi iudioi, which is oftentimes somewhat misrendered the Jews, which has led some people to think that John is anti-Semitic, because in some translations of the Gospel of John, it says things like the Jews were plotting to kill Jesus, or that the Jews set their face against Jesus. And that term, hoi iudioi, it's being used in a very intramural sense, that if you are in the Jewish community and you talk about hoi iudioi, you're specifically referring to the leaders of that movement. It would be like if you're part of a political party, let's say you're part of the Democratic Party for the sake of argument, and you are talking with your friends about what the Democrats are saying, and it's very clear that in context you mean those who are in the Senate and on the House or in the White House, then you're meaning sort of Democrats with a capital D, those who hold an official position. And so when it says the Jews, it doesn't mean every Jewish person. It certainly doesn't mean that, because Jesus was Jewish, his disciples were Jewish, the crowds that supported Jesus were Jewish, but it's saying that specifically the Jews with a capital J, the leadership among them, is what was the group that was hostile to Jesus and helped to engineer his crucifixion. So that makes perfect sense in a Jewish intramural dialogue, such as you see exactly the same usage of hoi iudioi in Josephus and in rabbinic documents in the Talmud.
Interesting. Yeah, I hadn't thought about that. But let me ask you this while I'm pulling up the next question, just briefly, and only because I know you've talked about it publicly before. You know, I when I'm reading all of your different books, right? There's something that I see in common with these books. Okay, with the books, I mean, regardless of the size of the book, I see you're efficient. I feel like when I read a chapter, I got like the information, right? I get the information. When I read some books, it almost seems like they're padding it a little bit with fluff to make it a little longer or something, or to or it's almost like, or maybe they want to tell their story more or something like that. But it's almost like there's these fillers all between all the information.
Yeah.
Yours is like a straight information in a like a really clear and precise sequence, and it's really perspicuous. And I was wondering, do you think that has to do with your OCD and having like this want or whatever to keep it in order, that kind of thing? What do you think about that?
I don't think that it has to do really with OCD.
Okay.
I think it has more to do with the fact that, first of all, being trained not only in the academic study of religion, but also trained in philosophy, I just do not like filler. It's one of my biggest pet peeves. It's something that any student of mine will tell you, and they might hate me for it, but I will take out my highlighter and I will say, this sentence is just here to fill up space. This sentence is just here to fill up space. This sentence is just here to fill up space. And guess what? If you deleted those, you wouldn't have your so many required pages. And so your doctor grade. They're used to seeing that because I tell them, look, a statement has to advance the argument somehow. It needs to be background information, premise, or conclusion. And if it's not one of those, you don't include it. So it's kind of my
It's more
tension as a
academic.
philosopher coming out,
Okay.
and saying, I'm not here to really spend time on details of my personal life or
Yeah.
anecdotes. That's not the point. I'm very firmly believing in sticking with the substance of the material. And it's
Yeah.
interesting that a great historian from which I had this modeled for me, I talk about him in the acknowledgments of the book, Dr. Edwin Yamuchi, who
Yeah, I noticed that.
was the key professor that I had at Miami University,
In
who got me
Florida.
interested in philosophy and religion. Yes. And if you read Dr. Yamuchi's books, like Persia in the Bible or Pre-Christian Gnosticism or Africa in the Bible, you'll see exactly the same type of structure. He doesn't give you any fillers, no matter how big or how small the book is. It's simply just the facts and the arguments. And
Right.
I
The information.
love that method of writing. So I'm glad to see that I'm not the only person
Oh, I
who
appreciate it.
observes that.
Well, yeah, listen. I appreciate it. That's why I wanted to mention it. And I noticed that in the acknowledgments that you mentioned him. He sounds like a very important person to you.
Yes,
And
yes.
I didn't know that you went to Miami. So
Hmm.
that was interesting. But yeah, I love that. And the thing is that sometimes I have ADHD, and so sometimes when I'm in conversation, right, I'm trying to get to, especially an in-depth topic, you're trying to get to the details, but there's all these other details that want to like tangentially come in. And like I'll get to the point through these other tangents, but I'm
Yeah,
like trying, with me it's a struggle.
yeah.
But I
It,
think in writing, you don't I think about it like this, like you talked about philosophy, right? And I can
hmm.
just imagine P implies Q, right? And I can just
Yes.
imagine like a 20 premise syllogism where it's like you're going through with a red marker and just like get rid of 7 and alter, 2 or something.
What's what's funny is that this semester I am teaching a class. The title of the class is critical thinking, and there are 11 writing assignments, and all 11 assignments features the students writing arguments. And that's what I do with every assignment, is that students want to put in things that aren't premises. They love to want to do that, you know. So one of my hot button writing assignments, because I've got a lot of student athletes, is um, make an argument either for or against this proposition that student athletes should get preferential treatments in their grades from the professor. Okay. And so many student athletes would like put in their personal story and what they've gone through. And I'm just striking it out, striking it out, striking it out. Irrelevant, irrelevant. This is a horrible argument. Redo it. I just want,
Yeah.
the facts supporting your case. You haven't said anything whatsoever to indicate why we should accept the conclusion. So yes.
Yeah, that's great. And yeah, I love that about your works. And so our next question here is from Samarian Squire. Says, question for Dr. MacGregor: would you reject the notion of a Johannine school, and
Yes.
how your conclusion maybe how do your conclusions affect the authorship of Revelation? You do mention the school hypothesis in regards to the anonymous authorship and so forth,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. 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 I reject the idea that a Johannine school is there. Um, I just I see no evidence for it. Um, I think it's a gratuitous supposition. The only evidence that one could possibly give for it is the use of we in John chapter 21 and in 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John. And once you see that in contemporaneous Greek documents that we used in that way is a forceful way of saying I when you're trying to bear authoritative witness to something, then that argument completely collapses. And so I just don't see any evidence for a Johannine school. Now, my conclusions don't really do anything to affect the authorship of the book of Revelation. My own view on the book of Revelation is that I don't think the same author wrote it as wrote the Gospel of John or the three letters of John. The style seems far too different. The literary style of those works just seems so far remote from one another that even though I've read, especially evangelicals, I don't know why there's sort of this penchant for wanting to ascribe all of this literature to the Apostle John. I don't see if there's any good reason to do it. It's like they must think that somehow by doing this, they're assuring the text's historicity. And what I'm trying to say is, look, there's a lot easier way to affirm the text historicity and the fact that the text comes from an eyewitness without having to jump through various hoops that you don't need to do to try to sort of implausibly argue that this is John, the son of Zebedee, who wrote the Gospel of John and 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John. Now, if all I know about the author of the book of Revelation is that it's not the same as the elder John. That I know, but as to who exactly that author is, I haven't delved into it. I have read arguments for early datings of the book of Revelation. I've read arguments for later datings of the book of Revelation. Do the political events make more sense in terms of Nero or as Vespasian as a Nero redivivu? And I'm undecided on that. And so I think that it's conceivable that Revelation could have been written by the Apostle John if Revelation should be dated somewhere in the 60s. That becomes a lot less plausible if you think that the John who wrote it is writing around 95. But in terms of the book, I don't say anything about Revelation.
Yeah, correct. Yeah, I was interested. Did you have a hypothesis about the author? But it sounds like you don't attribute it to anybody necessarily, or
Right. I mean, the only thing we know about the author is that his first name was John,
yeah, sure.
and John is about the 6th most common Jewish name in the 1st century. So that's not telling us a lot.
And it could even be somebody attributing like a pseudepigraphical work or something.
Yeah, I don't tend to see that as plausible. There isn't any reason to attribute pseudepigraphy to the work. So yeah, I would see that as ruled out. But yeah.
Yeah. So and I can tell you have a personal affinity with the Gospel of John as well.
Yes, I do.
Yeah. I think I remember you saying in a you do a lecture series with the group on he puts his stuff on YouTube. I forget the guy's name now, but he's a professor
with
well.
Theological Education Initiative.
Yeah.
And Dr. Rod Casey is the director of that, and he puts talks that I do online. So I did 2 lectures for Theological Education Initiative. I believe it was this past January on issues from this book.
Well, that's great. Yeah, because they really helped me out a lot. So, all right, so we have a few more questions here, and if you anytime that you need to like get going, you just say, "Hey, look, I don't."
Yeah, let's take about 3 more, and then.
Okay. I think we do have about 2 more. Yeah.
Okay.
So one was
that one.
Can he talk about? Oh no, sorry. Yeah, this is the same person. Next one. What about the charge that there are elements of Gnosticism in John's Gospel?
Well, that charge, first of all, it's interesting you should ask that because the best book answering that question was written by Edwin Yamuchi, whom I mentioned earlier, in his book, Pre-Christian Gnosticism, A Survey of the Proposed Evidences.
Really?
And in that book, he dismantles the hypothesis that there are elements of Gnosticism in the Gospel of John. And if you want to see all the details of how he does it, then that's the book to go to. But the short answer is that once you have the Dead Sea Scrolls in hand, you see that each purported idea that people once identified as being Gnostic is part and parcel of the worldview of the Essene community. So when that is brought to light, you see that you don't need Gnosticism at all as an interpretive framework for categories in the Gospel of John.
Okay, great. So I just want to maybe do one more, and then we'll. I want you to be able to. I want you to wrap it all up for us. But here's one about Revelation, but it's a little off topic because Revelation he just doesn't mention it. Um, well, there's two more here, okay, and I'll just get you to as brief or as long as you want on them. But if you had 30 seconds to explain to a KJV onlyist, they should relent. What would you appeal to?
Well, I'd appeal to textual criticism, and I would say that we have manuscripts of the New Testament which date to before the year 325, and you can use textual criticism on those manuscripts to reconstruct to an approximately 99% certainty what the original text of the New Testament was, and that that reconstruction does not feature many of the passages that are unique to only the King James Version. So you don't find in the earliest manuscripts passages where Jesus says, "For thine is the kingdom and the power and the glory forever." You don't find in any manuscript prior to the 14th century the Johannine comma, the Father, the Word, and the Holy Spirit, and these three are one thing. You don't find the Markan appendix, Mark 16, 9-20, in those manuscripts. You don't find the account of the woman taken in adultery in those early manuscripts, and so on and so on. So I would simply say that if we're to do our job as objective translators of a text, then we have to use the same criteria to reconstruct the New Testament that we would any other ancient document. We can't just say, oh, by historical accident, because in 1603 to 1611, the King James only translators had these documents at their disposal, and because biblical archaeology didn't exist yet, that now we're just stuck with having to refer to those. That would be like saying, since somebody in the 17th century made a translation of Plato, and we have much earlier manuscripts of Plato today, that we ought not to rely on them, or we ought to distrust them.
Yeah.
So that kind of reasoning would be insane.
Yeah, well, I know the argument's going to be, don't you know that Irenaeus told us that people are taking away and adding to the scripture? They just, it's like 1 John 5:7, right? It's like, it doesn't show up in the Greek until like, what, 1400 years or something?
Yes.
But it's in the Latin, and Cyprian in volume 5 of the Ante-Nicene Fathers.
Yes.
Cyprian mentions the
yes.
So people will make that argument.
Yeah. Talk about, grasping at straws. And that's not the way a real evidential chain looks. You wouldn't accept that for any other author. We should expect better scholarship when it comes to the Bible, and not worse than what we would use with secular documents.
Yeah, that's true. And the thing is, like, when I used to be a fundamentalist, this is going to be about 6 or 7 years ago, probably, or maybe longer than that. I would make that argument. I'd have the Cyprian quote, and I'd have, a lot of other sources and stuff that I had lined up. But when I hear people make it now, I just roll my eyes and go, "You accept that, huh?" Anyway, let's make that the last question.
All right.
And I just want you to take just like maybe 1 minute or 2 minutes, something like that, and just sum up, what is chapter 1 about? Did I miss anything? Is there anything that somebody should know that I left out?
Okay. So chapter 1 is about forming a cumulative case from the internal evidence in the Gospel of John. You know that the gospel is based on eyewitness testimony because you have this inclusio of eyewitness testimony. The question just is, who is the eyewitness? And we're told that this other disciple, who variously appears as the disciple whom Jesus loved, another disciple, the one who was bearing testimony, and so on, that at the very end, this person identifies himself as the author of the text. So if we're to take the text at its word, then the intervening material comes directly from an eyewitness source. Well, what do we learn about that eyewitness source from the text itself? We would glean from the various references that this person had Jerusalem as their primary seat of operations. That was their home base. They're writing from a distinctly Jerusalem perspective, where Galilee is on the distant horizon, quite different from the Synoptic Gospels. We would surmise that this author was intimately familiar with Jewish topography prior to the destruction of Jerusalem in the year 70. That mentions things like beside the sheep gate, there is Beth Zatha, a pool covered with 5 porticos. You have a person who is knowledgeable of the Jewish temple system, who knows insider arguments, such as Nicodemus coming to see Jesus secretly, such as the Sanhedrin having this closed-door meeting about trying to get rid of Jesus before somehow Jesus does something that causes the Romans to destroy them. We also find, based on the placement of this disciple at the table, that this is exactly the position that we would expect the owner of the house where the Last Supper was eaten to be. From the fact that this disciple is known to the high priest and clear security at the high priest's palace, we can infer that this is someone who is a friend of the high priest, someone who probably works in the same environment as the high priest, someone who is intimately involved in temple affairs, all of which fits the idea of a priest, that this person was at the cross, that Jesus entrusted his mother to this person, that this person saw a clear fluid and blood come out of Jesus' side when the soldier pierced through his heart with a lance, that this person was an eyewitness to the empty tomb and was an eyewitness to at least 2 resurrection appearances, actually at least 3 resurrection appearances of Jesus, and that we have very good reason to believe that this eyewitness testimony is authentic. Now, when we come to the external evidence, do we have that portrait confirmed or disconfirmed? Well, in the 1st and 2nd centuries, we have it confirmed, because in Papias, you have the notion that the John, son of Zebedee, is a different person than this John the disciple who continued to bear witness to Jesus in the 80s. And in Polycrates, we find exactly the same thing, that this John is expressly identified as a priest, which we could have guessed from the internal evidence alone, and that Irenaeus just read on his own without any preconceived ideas would show that the John who wrote the 4th gospel is a different person than John the Apostle.
Yeah, thanks so much. And that's one part that I did kind of skip over. I had a note about is the geography. Like, what is it? The Sea of Tiberias, I think that he mentions is that instead of he mentions like the Roman name of the water, the body of water.
Yes.
So yeah, I wouldn't even have thought about that. But anyway, yeah, I really appreciate you coming on, and I want to have you back to talk about these other chapters. Just hang around for 1 second. I'm going to go off air here, and then I got one thing to give you. And then you guys, I'm having Dr. Richard Averbeck on tomorrow afternoon, probably after, I'm thinking it's around 2, but it could be 3. So anyway, thanks for being here. Go out and get the book. The link's in the description already. And yeah, definitely contribute to the ministry that Kurt, his cause, because he's really doing a lot for us. Thanks a lot, and we'll see you tomorrow.